large category in terms of grouping of animals, and they reproduce after their kind. Now, we're discovering more and more as we study microbiology that this is actually the case, that plants and animals do not reproduce except within boundaries, within the kinds. And they don't go, there's never been an observed occurrence. In fact, that's part of the definition of a lot of, or at least a lot of believe the definition of a species is the inability to reproduce beyond the boundaries of the species. Now, I think the kinds are broader than that. That is beginning to be verified biologically, which is diametrically opposed to evolutionary theory. There's the continuity from one-celled animal all the way to, in their terminology, higher or more complex living organisms. But if you know anything about biology, there's no such thing as simple life. All life is complex at the cellular level. And we're learning all of that, which goes totally contrary to evolutionary thinking. Genesis is up to date. Genesis tells us that there's no reproduction across certain boundaries. So the meaning of that is that there's limitations to what you can expect in the natural realm. We call that variation within the kinds. And we have this permanence of the kinds that was initiated on day 3, at least in terms of plants. And we have this confirmed in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 15. All flesh is not the same flesh. There is one flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another flesh of birds, and another of fish. That statement in the New Testament is contrary to evolutionary thinking. There's a distinction between the kinds. Paul knew that. Paul knew Genesis. In fact, Paul alludes to Genesis on several other occasions. This is probably allusion to Genesis chapter 1. So we have the immediacy of fulfillment. We have the fixed nature of kinds within day 3. We're also going to see that in day 5 when we talk about animals. Same word is going to be used, min, and the boundaries for animals will be similar. Thirdly, the sequence of events. The sequence of events is totally contrary to evolutionary thinking. Just in day 3, let me lay out some of the contradictions with evolutionary thinking. Vegetation is produced on Earth. What does biology say? Life originated where? In some primordial soup or in the oceans. Well, Genesis 3, no. The oceans are separated from the land and the vegetation is on the land, not in the oceans. Totally contrary. So the sequence of events is different from the evolutionary thinking. Vegetation before the sun. This is why theologians have a hard time, because vegetation comes before the creation of the sun on day 4, out of sequence. Especially if you have long ages. How does plant life survive? Well, plant life, there's light for one thing created on day 1. So if there was a need for light, there was already light. So there's no need for the sun. And even, I know plants can survive for a period of time without light. One day doesn't make any difference. That is, if you take the text literally, as we do. So vegetation before the sun. So the sequence of events is contrary to evolutionary thinking. We also have complex forms. We have plants with seed bearing, and if you understand evolution, that's a very complex form of life. And later in the evolutionary scheme, not at the early stages. So the origin of life begins with full-blown complex life forms, although there's there's no such thing as simple life form. So we have complex plants that the evolutionary theory says is later in the evolutionary time frame. Fruit trees, and then also in the sequence, fruit trees before animal life. Another issue, these fruit trees, they need, what do they need to pollinate? They need animal life. They need animals, many of them do. They depend on bees, for example, for pollination or other insects. Yet, animal life is not on the scene. Now, that's not a problem if we're talking about a couple of days. But it's a major problem in the evolutionary scheme and time frame. So we have complex life. So these are arguments against the culture and the evolutionary thinking of the day in which we live in. How are we doing on time? How much time do we have, Jerry? Oh, half hour? Oh, I'll take an hour then. Now, let me go through this real quickly. I'm just going to mention this so that you will be aware, and I just came into a realization of this viewpoint. I've heard of, I guess, a form of it a while back, but apparently I've discovered recently that I guess the new thing, particularly in those that are closer to our camp, but not young earth people, those that are very conservative in their interpretation of Genesis 1 and other passages, and attempt to take them somewhat literally, although they open the door for some non-literal elements. So you might encounter this viewpoint, and that's the reason I wanted to present it, because again, this passage and Genesis 1 argues against it. A literal approach argues against all non-literal approaches, and I think the literal approach is the best approach. It's called the framework hypotheses. So let me familiarize you with it, because you may encounter it by scholars that we will gain a lot from. I won't even mention some of their names. Well, I'll mention Meredith Kline, who's pretty conservative, but yet he holds to this viewpoint. In fact, he's the main proponent. And if you're interested in a couple of books that lay these out, I can recommend them to you later on. Well, let me give you the major elements of the framework hypotheses. It is just another form, overall, of an attempt to accommodate Genesis 1. A lot of theologians have a very hard time taking it literally and taking the days as solar days and taking the details in the sequence that we talked about, the literal sequence. So they're coming up with all of these different accommodations. One of them is the framework hypotheses. We've talked about days as ages view. In fact, I mentioned an attempt by very conservative scholars in the introduction. The gap theory was an attempt by conservative scholars to somehow correlate the so-called findings of the day, the long ages of geology with the Genesis record. They put a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. I mentioned that grammatically you can't do that, that's not good, and it doesn't solve any of the geological problems anyway, and it just opens up the door for long ages anyway. Well, this is another one like that. Now, I also mentioned last time and gave you evidence for taking the passages literally and looking at them as a historical narrative. And I referred in that occasion to Stephen Boyd's work on an analysis of the Hebrew verbs that are predominant in narrative as opposed to poetic literature. The conclusion that he comes to is that statistically, at least, there's no way that this passage can be anything than historical narrative. So this is just an attempt to kind of sidetrack all of that. They view this figurative framework, and it begins with the chart that I already gave you, which I accept, but they make a big point out of the symmetry, and they take it one step beyond and say that the symmetry is part of the literary framework. That's where they get the word framework. And this argues that Moses intended to give us a literary piece because of the symmetry and other elements, and did not intend necessarily to take all of the elements literally or sequentially. In fact, that's another aspect. Now, I do believe that we do have this framework, if you will, but I don't take it that next step. I see it as this is the way God created it. This is the way God did it. This is what He tells us He did. It's not a literary device. It's the way that the creation week was unfolded. So we have this figurative framework that they set up, and there's other elements to it. Another major element is that there's some non-literal elements. Now, they do stress that they take Genesis 1 literally, but it does have some non-literal elements, is what they would say. Well, where does it stop? And how do you know which elements are literal and which aren't? So you're starting to get down that slippery slide. Personally, from the hermeneutic perspective, the common rule of thumb is you take a passage literally unless there are definite elements or evidence within the text to steer you to a non-literal approach. The Bible does use figures of speech. The issue is, do you find those kinds of things in Genesis 1? And I think overall the answer is no. So you have to find things in the text that the author intended you to take as evidence that he's using a figure of speech, a simile, or a metaphor, or something along those lines. When Jesus spoke in parables, He told us He's using a parable. And the Scripture is consistent. And parables are a unique literary form. So you interpret it in light of that. We don't see any of that in Genesis chapter 1. Also, this gives them kind of the leeway to see some of the events as non-sequential events. And just as the progressive creationists see the creation of the heavens and the earth in an evolutionary time frame as already created before day 4, so also does this viewpoint see day 4 as a recapitulation of day 1. In other words, an expansion of day 1. So God created the heavenly bodies on day 1, and now we have an expansion or recapitulation. So day 4 is not sequential with day 1. That's just one example.